Welcome to this conversation with Lily Mendoza and Jim Perkinson, part of our series called Changing Our Minds, a collaborative exploration of wisdom and action that might help humanity move into a new era of mutual flourishing for all species on the Earth, an era that we might call ecozoic in both geological and theological language. My name is Deborah Colvin. I'm part of the Earth Justice team at St James's Church in Piccadilly, and my background includes farming and science and education. The other members of the Changing Our Minds team are Sarah Mark, who is an artist and placemaker, and Diane Pachiti, who is a poet. They're both on the call today. Before we begin, many people online today are in the British Isles. We would like to acknowledge the long history of this land, now called Britain, and all of the beings within it. We know that humans have lived with this land for at least 35,000 years. And for much of this time, the land was acknowledged as sacred, with ceremonies, songs, and ways of relating that made a living bond between land and people. We also acknowledge our colonial and colonizing heritage in this place and across the world. So, our speakers today. The Changing Our Minds team first came across Jim's work via the Radical Discipleship blog, which we highly recommend, and we've put a link in the blog. Jim's a long-time activist and educator in inner city Detroit. He's a professor of social ethics at the Ecumenical Theological Seminary and lecturer in Intercultural Communication Studies at the University of Oakland in Michigan. He's the author of 5 books on theology and spirituality and 2 poetry books. He's also written extensively on questions of race, class, and colonialism in connection with religion and urban cultures. And then we met all together. We met Lily last autumn when she and Jim were visiting London, and both of them came and planted some bulbs in our ecozoic garden on Jermyn Street. So those of you who can come in person, please do come round and see them flowering right now. Lily is Professor of Culture and Communication at Oakland University in Michigan, and director of the Center for Babaylan Studies, a non-profit organization committed to decolonisation and indigenisation among diasporic Filipinos on Turtle Island. She hails originally from the Philippines, in the traditional homeland of the Aita and other indigenous peoples. Her latest co-edited book publication is Decolonising Eco-Theology, Indigenous and Subaltern Challenges. So welcome, Lily and Jim. It's been 6 months of conversation, and we're really delighted that we've got to this point. Would you like to say a word or two, or perhaps acknowledge your own places?
Yes, we're honored to be here, to be invited, and to have spent a little bit of time with you, to now be represented by a bulb. I have a bulbous head, but now I've got a bulbous flower in London. And babe, do you want to do the acknowledgement, or you want me to?
Sure. Maya pabengi ke kongan. Ako'y Lily Mendoza, anak ng Horacio Mendoza at Esperanza Luna, diri nanda kayong Maya pa ito. That's good greetings from my native tongue of Kapampangan. I was born and raised in Pampanga, a place called Pampanga by the riverbank. And Jim and I currently reside here in Wawiyatanong, the crooked way of the river, home of the Anishinaabe peoples, Wyandotte Huron, Fox, Miami, and so. And Pampanga, my home place in the Philippines, is the ancestral homeland of an amazing hunting and gathering people, the Aita tribes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I'm a white guy and rearranged by inner city Detroit over more than 35 years, part of the poorest congressional district of the country for most of those years, and then further rearranged by my partnership with Dr. Mendoza, Lily, my babe, and with her now over the last 20 years in particular trying to respond to indigenous folk who know how to live on the land where we are and many other places on the globe. So.
Thank you so much. So you gave us this really rich title to work with, so perhaps I can give you something back of that. You suggest that the powerful sacralities of Indigenous peoples persist despite the domination of modern ideologies. And Jim, this would seem to relate to what you say about Jesus as a Palestinian resistor against the Roman state. And for me, that also provokes questions about how Indigenous ideas and governance have influenced the shape of the modern American state. Could you share more of your thinking about all of this? So what does Indigenous governance look like, for example? What are sacralities in the way you're talking about them here, and how do they operate?
Yeah. So I think I would do that initially in relationship to the biblical text and then come up to the contemporary moment, United States of America, otherwise known as Turtle Island, from an Indigenous point of view. And what I would say about the Bible is that it's a state-produced text, beginning with 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, mostly leveraging, licensing royal land grabs, and it grows in both directions from there. Many prefaces stuck onto it as time went on, the prophetic movement adding all kinds of chapters afterwards. And again, it's written, it's scribally produced, scribes who are in the employ typically of state elites, and penning points of view that are beneficial to, or at least compatible with, kingdoms and monarchies. But the genius of it is that it has up inside it memory of folk who resisted monarchy, resisted top-down oppression and land grabs. And for me, then, it's a question of how do you read? How do you learn to read the text so that you pull up onto the surface the traces of this alternative history that was mostly repressed? And that as a schoolhouse in then doing that in other circumstances. My understanding of the big picture of history is that we've been on the planet for as long as 3 million years, depending what you consider a human being to be, or at least 200,000 years if you're going to limit us to Homo sapiens. But in any case, overwhelmingly, our majority time on the planet, we lived as hunting and gathering folk, adapting ourselves to our local ecologies. And for me, it seems that what the planet wants is life, and the way life happens is biodiversity. You have to have many things flourishing to have any one thing flourishing, and that includes us as a species. And our DNA, I think, was set on its current frequency out of that hunting and gathering experience. We do well in groups of 150 or less, where we can respond to a local ecosystem watershed that we know well. Our languages and cultures grew out of that embeddedness in local ecologies all over the planet. Some 7,000 different human languages, reflective of being schooled by and being responsible to a given local biodiversity of origin in a particular geozone landscape or ecozone. And then we started doing agriculture and entering into more of a reciprocal relationship. We continue to adapt, but we also adapt plant life and then animal life and pastoralism to us. And that starts about 10,000 years, 11,000 years ago. And that also can be done sustainably, but we begin to re-engineer, to impose, to coerce, and that 5,000 years ago or so leads into city-state formation. And maybe early on we were able, in a few places, to do city-state in a way that wasn't totally coercive, bent on forcing the majority of the people to produce surplus to support elites. But very quickly, it did move in that direction, and that then has rolled over the planet ever since. Monocrop agriculture, most people as peasants, some as pastoral animal herder folk, and then much later on industrialization and now digitalization. And there have been 80 plus civilizations in that mode, none of which have proven sustainable. They collapse their resource base and then they fracture into civil war or have to go elsewhere. And now we're faced with a situation where there are no more elsewheres. So reading the Bible in that strand, or that understanding of the big picture, I would understand Abram and Sarai to have been told to exit the city as pastoral nomads, and they then represent what becomes the first human or first social resistance movement our species was ever capable of, that happened all over the Mideast. It happened up on the Sea of Grass in Asia. It happened other places in the world. The herder folk integrated into that oppressive, extractive city-state economy could take their herd animals out and not return and be immediately integrated into the semi-arid grasslands around the cities. Peasant cultivators couldn't do that because they only had skills to plant, and they'd have to wait 6 months before they could eat. So it was particularly herders going nomad who became the first walkout resistance movement, and the biblical tradition partakes of that. Once the successor offspring of Abram and Sarah end up back in Egypt, embedded in empire, embedded in a city-state organization, oppressed, enslaved, and then are led out by Moses after a period of time, they eat by their herd animals. Yes, they eat manna, which is probably aphid defecation, scale insects eating tamarisk leaves, pooping 130% their body weight that puddles at the base of the plant and scooped up by Arab Bedouin today and called man, probably the Arabic cognate to the Hebrew manna. But they learned to live on the land. They were reintegrated into a lifestyle not of taking, but of being in reciprocal and very knowledgeable relationship with how the land operates and how it provides. And then, of course, Israel is a tribal reorganization movement embracing rebellious peasants from city-state systems on the Mediterranean seaboard who are Canaanite, that amalgamate with Joshua and the mixed multitude that came out of Egypt, who relearned the land over 40 years as pastoral nomads. And they settle into the hill country in Canaan. Iron technology was introduced at that time. For the first time, it became possible to cultivate small scale in that rocky interior, as well as to continue work with animals. 200 years or so, as this thing called Israel, got the Canaanite high god embedded in the name of the people, El, worshiping YHWH. It's a creative amalgam, but after a couple hundred years, it makes a choice to go city-state monarchical itself. Becomes top-down, heavy-handed, oppressive, galvanizes the prophetic movement, goes through 2 exiles, comes back as a colonized third world country under Persia, Greece, then Rome. Jesus steps onto that stage, schooled by John the Baptist, who was schooled by Bedouin pastoral nomads east of the Jordan, has to relearn the watershed, tutored by a dove, tested by rocks as a stone mason. He was probably not a carpenter, but a worker with stones and crafting buildings that way. So all of that is how I read the Bible and read Jesus then, yes, as resisting Roman occupation in Palestine, but having learned from particularly the wilderness history of his people. And I'll just take one more minute and then we can open it up for Lily. In the United States of America, when Euro-colonizers came over here, they initially had trouble surviving the environment. Of course, they did not know the plants and animals, the soils, the seasons, the weather, the waters. And the Haudenosaunee alliance of initially 5 tribes and then 6 tribes, 6 nations up in the present-day New York area, in part schooled some of the early colonizers, and some of their ideas ended up embedded in the US Constitution. Ideas about how to do democracy, and Ben Franklin acknowledged that in the middle of the 18th century as the US was coming together as a colonial state. But that acknowledgement has never been part of the history of the country, the mythology of the country, and we wouldn't be here if it were not for indigenous knowledge, wisdom, hospitality, and good graces offered to Euro colonizers when they first arrived. Instead, we unleashed genocide and reduced the population in total, from the top of Canada to the bottom of Argentina, of somewhere between 62 million and 145 million. Most of those folk genocidally eliminated. Roughly 2 to 5% left, but still there and living and speaking back, calling for land return and for acknowledgement of what they know about how to live here, that becomes more and more crucial if we are to have a future at all.
Thank you. 3 million years in 5 minutes. Fantastic. Lily.
Should I?
Would you like to respond to that, particularly about the nature perhaps of the indigenous sacralities?
Yeah, I was going to go right into the question that you had for me. I was wondering if that is...
if you'd like to do that, you go right ahead. You go right ahead. Shall I put that one out?
Yeah, sure.
Of course, yeah. So you speak really powerfully about your life journey, especially your intersectional experience as a Filipino of being both colonized and settler. And you've experienced really significant shifts in your spiritual orientation, which is my phrase. You might not say that. The way in which you describe these shifts, we found just really striking. So particularly the phrase "stunned by beauty," and your understanding of the huge significance of ritual seems really powerful. So could you say something about that? Particularly, I know that many of us deal with multiple and sometimes competing identities as well.
Thank you, Deborah. I'd be happy to. But as part of responding to the question of identifying not just as a colonized person, but also a settler, I probably need to add to my introduction and mention that besides acknowledging the native history under my feet, there's also the decimation of what used to be a thriving African-American community right where Jim and I live. Here in Detroit. It's a place that used to be called Black Bottom, named for its rich, loamy soil. And this thriving Black neighborhood was summarily demolished for redevelopment in the late 1950s to give way to a gentrified residential district, with the residents given a mere 30-day notice to vacate what had been their historic home place. And underneath all the development and the construction of towns and cities was the requisite clear-cutting of thick and lush forests and the driving away of wildlife, Michigan being once 95% forested prior to Euro-American settlement. And I'm having to name these truths about the place where we currently reside, not just as pro forma, but as part of the discipline of unlearning my settler privilege, recognizing that my presence here on this land as a non-Indigenous person means I'm a beneficiary not only of Native genocide, but of African-American dispossession and land theft. And prior to that, of the ecocidal elimination of our more than human kin to build this motor city, Detroit being home to the Industrial Revolution in the US. And so I identify not only as an immigrant to Turtle Island, but as a settler. As one Mohawk scholar once said to me, it doesn't matter if your people were brought here through historic colonization. As far as Native peoples are concerned, you are still settlers. Something I've had to sit with for a long time and have the grief of that reality tutor me in quite profound ways. But realizing my settler privilege here in the US is one thing. Recognizing my settler privilege as a Filipina back in my homeland is quite another. And I'm not sure how many of you here know a bit about the history of my country, especially in relation to the United States. But just quickly, the Philippines is actually the US first Vietnam. Its occupation at the turn of the 20th century is what catapulted the US to superpowerdom, because it's what it takes to become a superpower, the taking over of territories and appropriating their riches for one's own wealth accumulation. But the ruse, as put forward by then President William McKinley, when queried by a Methodist delegation on his decision to invade the Philippines, takes the cover of a civilizing mission. And I quote, "The truth is, I didn't want the Philippines. And when they came to us as a gift from the gods, I did not know what to do with them. I walked the floor of the White House night after night, praying Almighty God for light and guidance. And one night it came to me this way. Number one, that we could not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly. Two, that we could not turn them over to France and Germany. That would be bad business. Three, that we could not leave them to themselves. They were, as a rule, unfit for self-government. And four, that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift, civilize, and Christianize them," unquote. And that was how over 70,000 troops were sent over to invade us, just at the point when we had just declared our independence from 350 years of Spanish rule, massacring over 500,000 to 1 million Filipinos, or 1/6 of the total population, and fomenting a reign of terror as Filipino fighters continued to wage a fierce guerrilla warfare a decade into the US occupation. Only by the arrival of what one scholar called the civilian army of occupation, that is, the Thomasites, the hundreds of American educators, Peace Corps volunteers, and American missionaries, did the pacification campaign succeed, the battle having shifted onto the ideological ground. I am a product of that massive colonial undertaking, ostensibly meant to disabuse us from our backward and barbaric ways in an act of benevolent assimilation, and not the fact that the Philippines was super rich in natural resources and strategically located, a perfect launching pad for the US military and economic ambitions in the Pacific and beyond. So effective was the missionization of the schools and churches that many of us, especially those among the educated elite, ended up singing the praises of Western progress and civilization. Nationalism meant identification with a progressive, modernizing nation state, vying for entry into the world of civilized nations. And to the degree mainstream Filipinos were co-opted to that vision, we became agents of our own self-colonization, turning away from the sacrality of our land-based traditions and in turn enacting the same colonizing logic towards our own still land-based indigenous peoples who today continue to struggle for survival, all 14 to 17 million of them. My own personal story in this regard is that of a dyed-in-the-wool child of civilization, a pastor's kid, my father being one of the early converts to Protestant Methodism, with a born-again experience in college and some of the best years of my life spent missionizing the intelligentsia. But unbeknownst to many, I suffered from a psychic affliction that no amount of the preaching of God's love could assuage or heal. It was a sense of being weighed and found wanting, constantly, something akin to what W.E.B. Du Bois speaks about as, quote, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, unquote. It was also the case that the universalism of my Christian faith disconnected me from any cultural grounding. I was a child of God and a Filipina only by accident. That is, until my faithful encounter with the world of our indigenous peoples, of all places, in a graduate seminar in the humanities called The Image of the Filipino in the Arts, taught by an ethnomusicology professor who brought into the classroom the amazing arts of our indigenous communities that were the least penetrated by modern development and Christianization. He brought to the classroom their intricate weaving designs, the wild, vibrant colors of their textiles, their basketry, dances, songs, mythic stories, and chants, and what this expressed in terms of a different way of being in the world. I was introduced to the delicate sensitivity of kapwa, or shared being, the generosity of community, the reverential relationship with the earth that took nothing without asking for permission and without giving something back ritually in return. The gracious receiving of gifts of beauty and creativity from the other world through dreams and visions. I was stunned by beauty. And I said, these are my people. I belong to a beautiful people. And this began my deep psychic healing. And having fallen in love with the beauty of that different way of being that I found in the world of our indigenous peoples, I became consumed with a desire to do all I can to stop its annihilation and disappearance. I asked, what is this inferiorizing civilizational narrative that would turn an otherwise healthy, wholesome, thriving peoples living sustainably on the land into degraded, subhuman, primitive subjects, all of a sudden needing salvation and deliverance from their wicked and savage ways? And so just to run down quickly some of what I found in my work, that civilizational narrative is actually premised on a number of unnamed presuppositions. One, the denigration and demonization of all land-based subsistence ways of living, such that today we're unable to countenance life on the land, be it that of hunting and gathering, small-scale subsistence agriculture, or pastoral nomadism as anything more than an animal-like existence, but actually constituting 97% of our time on the planet. Number two, the absence of coercive structures of governance, no taxation, no hierarchical system of government, no standing armies, etc., as a signifier of backwardness and primitivism. Any social arrangement that didn't fit the domination control paradigm was misrecognized as anarchic and therefore uncivilized. And this is where you get the construction of Palestine as a land without the people. And three, the lack of private ownership, no ownership of land, everything shared in common with an ethic of abundance and generosity, and not only towards fellow humans, but towards all beings, as totally scandalous and unacceptable. Yeah, the Europeans were scandalized to find us without this concept of private property. And in terms of defining what constituted a full human being, you had to have the following. One, a form of rationality exclusive of feelings, passions, and intuition. Two, an acquisitive nature committed to an aggressive pursuit of material wealth. Three, efficiency as the highest value, going for maximum outcome with minimum effort, now enshrined in the modern corporation. Fourth, belief in individualism, the notion of a sovereign and masterful self, unconstrained by the baggage of communal obligations, free to do whatever it wants, etc. And as we've already mentioned, private ownership, where the introduction of the Regalian Doctrine, the Spanish version of the Doctrine of Discovery, saw the closing of the commons and the expropriation of non-titled indigenous lands into state property, turning most indigenous peoples as squatters in their own ancestral homelands. And so with these default assumptions, what happened is that any other life way that didn't answer to these modern civilizational imperatives are by default less than and may be taken over, dispossessed of their territories, if not outrightly eliminated for being in the way of progress and advancement. And it is in this way that I see the cultural logic governing the relations between us, modernized, upwardly mobile Filipinos, and the country's indigenous peoples. In my case, the dark-skinned, kinky-haired Aita people, amazing nomadic hunter and gatherers with encyclopedic knowledge of their land bases, and they're still around, as no different than that of settlers. And I'm sure this is in no way unique to the Philippines, but now the condition prevailing in all nations around the globe.
Yeah.
Let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Could you speak to your experience of ritual and the power of ritual in kind of breaking through some of this?
Yeah, I was going to reserve that for the other question, but yeah. So a fundamental lesson that I learned. I always wondered about why indigenous peoples are big on ritual. And I began to understand, and no matter how materially impoverished they are, whenever they do these rituals, they always spare no effort to create something beautiful. And I realized that that is the way, that is the language of communication with the natural world that they call the holy in nature, banal na kalikasan, right? And so what does it mean? What will it mean for us to have that kind of a relationship with the natural world where you treated her and you treated her beings as worthy of offerings? It's the way that they feed the world with beauty, because that is the food. That's the food for the gods, and the gods are the trees, the mountains. That's why we were called idolaters, because that is the way that we related to the natural world, and I see that still in our intact communities before the introduction of a transcendent God that is separate from the created order. We didn't have that. So it is when I participate in these these ritual enactments are taught by the land herself. They learn it from a very intimate connection with the beings in their particular ecology. So their dances, their weaving designs are reflective of the particular ecology where their ancestors have lived, where they've spent all their generations. The mythic stories are also part of that. They're not created, they're not just human invention. And I began to understand that this is what it means to have real culture. It's not just an invention, but it's worked out in intimate and sacred relationship with the beings that are in that land.
Yeah, absolutely.
So could I kick off from that?
Please do, yeah.
And I'll get to Sarah has a question here too. I'll circle around to that in just a second. So my own version of that was arriving in 1974, East Side, inner city Detroit, as I mentioned. And initially thinking I was on mission as an evangelical, charismatic white boy to help poor people in the inner city deal with poverty. And it took me, I was part of a community of folk who were pooling income and assets on a poverty level basis, black and white, married and single together, intense form of community, running all kinds of ministry in the neighborhood. But it took me 8 years to get to the point where I could finally start to see the amazing creativity and survival skills of low-income African-American folk up against the wall of poverty, making desperation yield beauty in spite of itself, in largely using their repertoire of percussive culture, rhythmic, polyrhythmic ways of engaging reality, not just in music, but just in conversation with each other in the street corner, call response modalities of interacting, preaching in Black church that also shows up in things like jazz and hip hop and funk. And once I saw it and saw the way it was operating just in everyday life all the time, I fell in love and I realized, whoa, I'm not here to help anybody do anything, but to learn about white skin, to learn about this thing called Detroit, this bigger thing called the United States of America, from folk who've experienced it very differently than me. And in particular, what I was confronted with was an entirely different spiritual vocabulary, a vocabulary of call, response, rhythm, hell-bent on energizing everybody, all the bodies, and this deep, deep cultural exploration of life using that kind of rhythmic modality, percussive intelligence. You see it in Toni Morrison, you see it in all kinds of Black writers. And in effect, they were able to probe the city with that. If you look at the history in this country of slavery giving birth to the spirituals, and then post-Civil War and the end of slavery, blues culture, where for the first time Black folk could celebrate their romantic life even when it fell apart, and you got hit with the blues. But then they take it up in the city and it becomes jazz, and it's probing the angularity and the hard surfaces of the city musically and rhythmically. And then hip hop in the early 70s in New York doing the same thing, taking a minimal amount of economic resources and using that to make maximal commentary and these constant probings of reality verbally, in bodies in motion, breakdancing, DJing, but taking something like a vinyl record designed by a corporation to be consumed and putting it on two turntables side by side with a toggle switch in between, so you could find the break in the record and extend that break for half an hour, however long you want to enable breakdancing to happen, making a commodity to be consumed into an instrument of creativity outside corporate intentionality. And once I started to see that and fell in love with it, comes out in me in terms of spoken word poetry. White guy doing that, have to stay in relationship with Black people so they can check me, because that could easily become appropriation. But it is a matter of letting me be rearranged by that deep cultural form that goes way back to more indigenous ways of living and engaging reality. And then more recently, for me, getting involved in Detroit in the water struggle, where we had an emergency manager imposed in 2014 by the governor of the state of Michigan with virtual dictatorial powers. And one of the things that began to happen was shutting off anybody who was $150 or 2 months in arrears on their water. $5 million contract handed off to Homerick Wrecking Corporation to sweep through neighborhoods, particularly poor Black and brown neighborhoods, early in the morning, shutting off water to clean up the bad debt on the water department's books, ultimately we think to be able to privatize the water system. And that here in Detroit where the Detroit River runs by, that is to say, 20% of the Earth's fresh surface water goes by the base of Detroit in a century that is obviously going to be the century of water wars, the way last century was the century of oil wars. We're now at a place as a species where water is being gobbled up, grabbed up by banks and all kinds of corporate interest, commodified, and will only be available, already is only available to certain segments of society. So we began to do, we being a movement in Detroit led by older African-American women, younger hip-hop heads, and some of us who are white or other ethnic backgrounds, under their leadership, pushing back in every way we could, demonstrations, articles, protest, and nonviolent civil disobedience, blocking shutoff trucks. In the middle of that, 2015, we did a walk to join the water struggle in Detroit with the water struggle in Flint, where the system had been poisoned by the emergency manager, switching it over to the Flint River. 8 days walking from Detroit to Flint, but it began with a water ritual at the Detroit River, and we had Mona Stonefish, an Anishinaabe woman, do what her people do. She pulled up some water. She talked to the water as if it's a living, active, spirited persona, and did the ritual. And then that kicked off the walk. And it also kicked off me having to rethink my relationship with water, no longer as just a human right that we struggle to make sure everybody has access to, but first of all, her own right. She belongs to herself. And so I started doing research and learning from indigenous folk, Three Fires folk, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi folk here. And they relate to water as this huge persona. I'm not going to use their names because you only do that when the waters are frozen over, because you don't want to summon them out of the water. And then if you do, you owe them ritual. But they relate to the waters as these fierce creatures that they have to be in respectful, honoring relationship with, which means learning the details of how water functions, but also learning this kind of spiritual aura or persona that is embodied in the water. So I started doing that, and then went back to the biblical tradition as well as to some of my Celtic ancestry, asking, well, how did folk back in the Bible think about water, and how did Celtic folk think about water? And that gets into the question of a rewilding of Jesus that Sarah has up here in the chat. And rereading the Bible with my eyes opened to this bigger question of agency and who the characters are who are acting. It's not just Jesus, it's not just prophets, it's not just Mary, it's not just Deborah back in the Hebrew scriptures. Oldest image we have of divinity in that part of the world is as a storm god, because water's everything in the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean. And the waters coming off the Mediterranean seasonally in late September, early October, honored in Sukkot, the Feast of Booths in the Hebrew scripture, which was really a rain invocation ceremony to call the western waters in the form of storms to end the summer drought and the sirocco winds from the southeast coming off the desert. And that then becomes this huge memory of relating to water. And Jesus, when he begins his ministry under the hands of John, he has to go into the waters and comes up out of the waters, and it says the heavens opened, which elsewhere in scripture is reflective of a cloudburst, a storm. So you could read it as he's adopted by a storm. That's very indigenous, to go out into the wild and stay there till some wild creature says to, in effect, oh, okay, you're serious. Let me adopt you and teach you about me, and you go back to your people, your human species, and communicate what my creatureliness, my spirit is all about, so they can respect us. So did Jesus then have to do that with water? Well, you can make the case that he becomes a water advocate, challenging the commodification of water by the priests, charging a half shekel tax to ensure the rains fall and the fields are fertile, when he goes in John 7 up into the Feast of Booths, Sukkot ceremony, interrupts it on the last day, and says, let anyone who's thirsty come and drink, for out of his belly will flow rivers of living water. Living water in the Jewish tradition is water that's not been touched by human hands or human technology, that has come as wild gift from the storms hitting the mountains. The mountains are the image of political leadership that confers blessing and bounty on everybody downstream, irrespective of whether they're worthy or not. And Jesus, in effect, channels Isaiah 55, which talks about water coming from the mountains. But there's a wrinkle up in there that's even more amazing, in that the literal word in Greek for belly is womb. It's a gender-bending reference. And the image is a woman breaking water. But it's related to nature breaking water constantly so that life can happen. And all of that, if you want to read it that way, is Jesus opening up, confronting the powers that be in the temple who are trying to commandeer water, and asserting, no, water is a wild gift, living, active, and is a she in ancient Near Eastern ways of understanding it. So let me stop there before I pick up all the time.
Amazing. It puts me immediately in mind of the original gift of water to this planet. You know, the million years of rain on the hot, rocky place. We were nothing until the gift of water. Amazing. So Sarah's got a question in there about a rewilded Christ. Do you want to say something about that, Jim?
Well,
I mean, you've said it. You've said it. Absolutely. Sorry.
I mean, I can say a whole lot more, but
I know. Let me go on to Lily then, because we're in big picture. Lily, you talk about your longing for the birthing of new visions and new desires, kind of a recognizing of poverty of spirit that's resulted from this Western civilizing project. What gives you hope that this might come about, or what it might look like?
Thank you for that question. In one essay that I wrote, I said, it's not enough to see what is wrong in the world. One needs to fall in love, so that whatever initiatives, whatever transformation comes out of that doesn't come from a should, that has never worked. I should do this. But when you fall in love, something happens to you. It breaks you open. And then you do what impossible, amazing things that otherwise you wouldn't. But for me, the greatest gift to me of my encounter with our Indigenous peoples is the understanding that life is ultimately not about us, not about us humans, but about being part of this grand orchestra of beings, all engaged in keeping life alive through living beautifully and magnificently according to their nature. And so I suggest that this is the key to our liberation from our captivity to our modern culture's insatiable greed and narcissism. Our Indigenous teacher, Martin Prechtel, warns that attempting to strike a better bargain than this makes a culture murderous, right? And that is why land-rooted cultures typically orient their energies toward other than surplus production and material accumulation. It's not only to avoid incurring heavy indebtedness to the earth, but because they elaborate meaning elsewhere. So our teacher speaks of one native Mayan village in Guatemala, if I may share a quote here. The Chutuhil Mayans were not trying to build a non-suffering world, the world they were part of was not run by humans, and it had only live things residing in it. There were no dead things. Instead of eradicating all the misery of the world, the Chutuhil were trying to suffer together creatively in a beautiful way to keep their world of delicately balanced live things more vital by feeding it the grief of their human failures and stupidity. These failures were made beautiful by the ornate and graceful way the people dedicated their suffering to the earth and to that which made life live in a proven ritual attitude of great antiquity. And so for me, the question is how do we, I was confronted one time by an elder who said, your way of life is killing our way of life. How do we stare into the reality that if left on their own, they would have continued living in this sacred relationship with the earth. But our expansionist culture that knows no limit to it, it's constructed, the economy is constructed to create more and more and more desires, to work on us, on our fantasies, right? To hook us into needing stuff.
Yeah.
And where does that stuff come from? Now, the only remaining unexploited places are those under the feet of Indigenous people. And so when I go home, my project is not so much about helping our Indigenous people. Of course, they now need help. Why did they thrive for millennia on their own, knowing how to live and thrive in their places? And then all of a sudden they become mendicants, they become so poor that they need help. So I say my project is not about helping them, but helping us. We are the most pitiful ones, the ones who have lost our capacities to work with our hands, to make life as we used to know how to do. When you go back far enough in our ancestry, you have ancestors who knew how to live on the land. It doesn't matter if you're European descent, you also had those. All of us knew how to do. Yeah. And just as a final quote, I just have to share this. Always. It's a quote from Arundhati Roy. She says, the first step towards reimagining a world gone terribly wrong would be to stop the annihilation of those who have a different imagination, an imagination which has an altogether different understanding of what constitutes happiness and fulfillment, who may look like the keepers of our past, but who may really be the guides to our future. And last thing they would say, even to the end, even if we don't make it, we will make beauty anyway.
Yes. The making of beauty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe a little quick commentary camped out on that, again, to pull some of what you sent us up into the mix here, the Cain and Abel story.
Yeah.
Which I would understand as part of this preface material for the Bible, Genesis 1 through 11. Life in the garden is good. The fall is a fall into agriculture, results in hard labor for Adam, hard labor in birth because you're now eating carbohydrates and the fetuses are bigger. That results in the primal murder, which is farmer killing pastoral nomad, Cain. Abel is pastoral nomad, Cain is the farmer. Cain then being, in a sense, exiled from the land, becoming the first city builder, that resulting in so much boundary trespass. You have floods as an intervention to try to restore balance. Tower of Babel comes out the other side of that city, mimicking the wild mountain that captures the storm, that provides the water. That has to be interrupted. That's all preface to the beginning of what becomes the biblical tradition, which I mentioned is the very first thing we're told about anybody specific to Jewishness and what becomes Israel and what becomes Jesus and Christianity is Abram, leave the city. It's a counter city, back to the land kind of tradition. And Abel represents the primal murderer, and Abel's blood is swallowed by the soil in the Genesis text. The mouth of the ground consumes the soil, and the cry that emanates from that is both a cry of Abel as human being and of the soil. You can't really break it apart from the two together. It's a kind of ecozoic reality, an amalgam of human and land that is crying out. And then that cry arguably hovers over the whole biblical tradition all the way up to the book of Revelation in chapter 18, which imagines the downfall of Babylon as archetypal city coming apart. Why? Because all the blood of the innocents shed from the foundation of the world was found up inside the city. Where? Not kept in little vials on a shelf somewhere. All the infrastructure of the city is itself marked by the blood of indigenous folk pushed off their land, either enslaved as labor or just disappeared, killed off. And all of the water, the sand, the wood, the marble, the stone, et cetera, that makes up the city is itself spiritual from an indigenous point of view, carrying a charge of ruach, of persona, of animation. That's still there, but now it's a spirituality that is out of niche and out of relationship with all the other spirits, spirited pieces of nature. So it's simultaneously inflated in an imperial project beyond itself, but it's also deflated, and it operates like a hungry ghost that gets talked about in the biblical tradition as principalities and powers. When it's in sync, it's an angelic force, a good messaging force, which is what Evangelion means. Good, angel is up inside that word. And elemental spirits, angels, there's not a hard and fast line between those things. And one way of understanding them is that's a way of that community and that ecology giving voice, human voice, to these powers that in their natural ambit make life possible in our life. But when they're ripped out of context and reassembled as a monstrous human venture, they become monstrous as well. But what needs to happen is not the destruction of those forces, but a return to scale. And indeed, I could talk about where that shows up in the Bible too, but maybe that's enough.
Is that resacralizing from our point of view, or is it not down to us to do the sacralizing?
Yeah, I think it means having, one of the things Prechtel said to us one time is, why don't you take your cell phone and choose one of the 1,000 plus elements that are up in there and start to relate to it as if it's a living creature. Do research, find out where it came from, what ecozone, where it has its home, its natural habitat, and then figure out what it would take to honor that creature in its home environment with other creatures, ritually and mythically. How would you tell a story about it that conferred respect on it? And how would you give it beauty in terms of eloquence that you give and in terms of beauty that you create, like beads that you make and then give and leave out in wild nature and walk away. Native American folk use tobacco. The bead thing is much older and scattered across the globe. Indigenous cultures giving beads back to wild nature for taking things from wild nature needed to live. But what if you did that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do we leave the city? The 9 billion of us.
Can't at the moment.
We can't physically, but maybe how do we do it psychically, spiritually, where we are?
Yeah. Well, I talk about learning to walk on two legs. One is a leg that's immediately committed to dealing with the trauma and the suffering and the injustice going on. So for me, the water struggle in recent years. But being engaged, being involved with what's actually hurting people right now and pushing back on that, working with them in any way that I can be useful. The other leg is the leg asking this bigger question. What's really sustainable from the big picture, long-term point of view, in which cities are not. I'm a city guy. I've lived in cities all my life. They taught me the deepest things I know about living life. And yet I think they're ultimately not sustainable. And so how do I develop, one, an understanding of that, and two, an emotional relationship with it that can honor the elements of beauty that are up in the city, but also recognize the trauma that has gone into getting those beautiful things up there, like Black folk using their musical traditions, jazz and hip hop in particular, to bring a beauty vibe out of the trauma of the infrastructure of a ghetto.
Yeah, extraordinary. Do you want
we are also,
that? Yeah,
go, Lily. We are also warned not to flee, right? Because our tendency is to want a pure space. But what would it mean to understand our compromise? Everything is contaminated, and I don't know. They're even saying that there are not enough places where people can go back to living on the land again, right? And so for me, living where we do is a schooling in grief, composting. I don't know that I do it very well, but even when I step into the shower and turn on the hot water, I realize, what did it take to bring in this piped in water supply to me? And what it does is for me to then shift my lens. Like we have in the Philippines a tribe that is terrified at being hooked to the grid. They lived without electricity all this time, and they were doing just fine. But those of us modernizers and development-minded, well-meaning, right? Well-meaning folks want to help, want to extend the benefits of our conveniences to them, but they said that will be the end of us.
Yeah.
You bring in electrification, and you bring in televisions, you bring in all the advertising, that it will be the end of us. So are we able to look at these ways of living not as, degraded? Of course, when they take place in communities that could hardly make ends meet anymore because they've been taken off their land, that is a different question. But for those who can still live with a measure of intactness, are we able to see the beauty in that?
Yeah. And are we able perhaps to bring that to beautifying our own lives? Because beautifying, to genuinely beautify our lives would be having to live very, very differently.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a question Chris Jackson has in the chat that I think is important here, talking about living in the countryside and is that having a greater environmental impact than living in a small flat in London? And I'd be interested in how we do the calculus about that. I mean, part of the issue for me is, can I push myself to really learn how to count the costs from point of extraction through life cycle to point of discard of any given thing, which we don't do. Certainly our accounting procedures don't do that, but neither does our pushing for green energy solutions, which, yes, I think are better than fossil fuel. But if you really do the calculus of what it takes to come up with a modern solar panel farm, you go to wind energy and do all the calculus of everything involved in needing to produce that stuff, and what happens with it when you discard it? What happens with the blades? Where do you put them? What kind of toxins do they carry? What kind of chemicals do they have up inside them? And to do the calculus and really understand the cost to the planet of any of our technology is now almost impossible because it's so involved. And it's a bigger impact than we realize. But here we are. And so, yeah, there's some people who are saying, well, 30 by 30, if we can get 30% of the Earth's surface available as wild and off limits to humans, and all of us live in cities, that may be the only way to do it as a population of 8 billion on this planet. A planet where now the average food has to travel 1,367 miles, according to George Monbiot over there in your country doing his analysis of this. Which means we've got cities that don't have enough hinterland around them to feed the population. They have to import food from, on average, more than 1,000 miles away. What have we done? What is this infrastructure, armature, prosthesis of our species? Whatever it is, it's overreach. It's overshoot.
The vision of the good life that's being peddled all around, creating discontent for people who prior to being exposed to it would have been, living in balance. It's the colonization of all our imaginations.
Yeah.
In Detroit, community urban gardening is a big thing because Detroit's 139 square miles, so much vacant land now because of white flight that you can put all of San Francisco or all of Boston in the vacant land in Detroit. And, city officials look at that as blight and problem. Creative folk, grassroots on the ground, look at it as this is probably the only viable future for the city. And so, gardening right where we are, any way we can, getting involved again with the soil, I think is a piece of what we need to be doing. And then the question about, but how do we learn from indigenous without appropriating them? Even in the process of doing community gardening, I think we need to be in conversation with Anishinaabe folk who are still around, about 40,000 of them in the metropolitan Detroit area, because this is still their land. And ultimately, justice would mean giving the land back to them, and we need to be working for that, even as we're trying to figure out how to relate to it and live on it and learn from it. And so it's all of that, I think. It's complex. There's not a clear, simple remedy, but we do what we can. And as Lily was saying, and as I'm saying, make beauty while we do it. Do it with style. And maybe wither with style as an entire species as well as individuals. Can we learn to get smaller with style?
I don't think we can find a better moment to to perhaps draw this to a close. So everybody who's listening, we're going to wither with style while making beauty. Quite an extraordinary send out for us all, I think. Both of you, thank you so much. That's absolutely really unbelievable for us, and we are really, really grateful for your time and for your wisdom and for your communication. And I really hope we at St James's Folk, and I know there's a broad selection of people on here, but I really hope that we stay in touch, and we'll certainly be honouring your contribution through our own gardening and projects. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, thank
All
you.
good wishes.
Thank you.
Take care.
Yes.